Hello, welcome to our Apex Inland Empire and now ASCM, the Association for Supply Chain Management webinar. We're excited to continue with our Emerging with Supply Chain Strength webinar series. As I talked last month, Apex Inland Empire, we are still based on the APEX standards and the APEX education and certifications, but we've been rebranded, if you will, to the Association for Supply Chain Management. And so just to clarify who we are, and we've been doing a webinar series that we're continuing on doing. We're going to continue them through the rest of this year. Once a month to have a webinar on emerging from this pandemic with supply chain strength, which has really been quite the challenge. And today we're really excited to have Ian with us. Gosh, Ian, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name. Is it Oxnevad? Is that how you say it?
It's close enough.
Okay, good. Very good. Well, I'm going to call him Ian O. So it's good to have Ian with us today. To talk about political risk and the global supply chain. I've heard him talk a few times actually now, and he's just fascinating. And it's really critical information for those of us that are working in manufacturing, distribution, supply chain, just such a critical topic. So Dr. Ian is a political scientist and political economist who specializes in issues of geopolitical and economic overlap, such as geoeconomics, economic warfare, corporate espionage, political and economic risk, and terrorist financing, and money laundering, all sorts of like fascinating topics here. As an academic, he has extensively published research on these issues, as well as on the Middle East and other regions of the world. He's the co-author of the Middle East Politics for the New Millennium, a constructivist approach, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Making a Killing, States, Banks, and Terrorism. And so that would be really interesting. I can't wait to have that come out. It's due later this year. And he's also the president and CEO of Monitum Analytics and regularly assists clients on matters of political and economic risk. So with that said, I forgot to mention, so I'm going to do it now, that we want to thank the Inland Empire, the Apex Inland Empire Board of Directors, and I also want to thank LMA Consulting for hosting these webinars. And I'm Lisa Anderson, and I am the president of Apex Inland Empire and also the president of LMA Consulting. And so with that said, we'll welcome Ian as a webinar speaker. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A section, and I will feed them to Ian as we go and throughout. So with that said, Ian, we'll turn it over to you. So go ahead and kick it off.
Great, thanks for having me. All right, so I hope everyone can see this. So I want to talk a little bit about political risk and global supply chains. Now, when I say political risk, most people don't necessarily know what that is until it takes some explanation. And global supply chains, there's no such thing as a global community. Everything is ultimately local and connected. There are different levels at the legal and jurisdictional level that you're talking about when you're talking about political risk, but ultimately international ultimately affects local and vice versa. There really is no separation. Now, I want to start off with something of an example. Now, one of the top emerging economies is India. Now, India, believe it or not, has one of the largest pharmaceutical export industries in the world. It manufactures a lot of generic drugs that are affordable in developing countries, and specifically in Africa. Now, CADILA Pharmaceuticals got started in the 1970s, really doing generics, and then sort of picked up pace when it started manufacturing HIV treatments. Well, in the early 2000s, it was seeking to break into the African market. And it was looking at Ethiopia as a place to invest and access that emerging market. Now, in 2004, when it entered the market, Ethiopia had an annual GDP growth of 9.3%, which is pretty good. It's one of the top growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's interesting about CADILA is with their philosophy, they came in, they put in greenfield investment, there was a massive increase in Indian investment into Ethiopia. So for example, in 2008, 414 Indian companies with an annual value of about $4.5 billion were investing in Ethiopia. And that was a 100% increase from the year before. So you're talking about a massive influx of foreign direct investment into Ethiopia. And even if you're not interested in pharmaceuticals, if you're interested in coffee, because Ethiopia manufactures great coffee, it's actually where coffee's from, this story is still relevant to you. Now, Ethiopia, if CADILA had done its due diligence, its good political due diligence risk, it would know that the country is relatively prone to two types of fundamental risks. One is environmental with famine, and the other is the country is very prone to ethnic civil war. Now, if you look at Ethiopia's modern history from the 1970s up through 1991, it was in a major war, civil war with a communist regime in Addis Ababa. And you're also talking about ongoing ethnic tensions that arose out of this. Now, you had a war with Ethiopia or Eritrea afterwards. Now, what's interesting about this dynamic is that if you look at Eritrea, Eritrea is critical to Ethiopia's success, largely because 2 out of the 3 ports that it uses for all exports go through Eritrea, Djibouti being the third. Now, the Ethiopian People's Democratic Front, which was the coalition of parties, political parties that emerged out of Ethiopia's civil war that ended in the 1990s, that coalition, not that long ago, started to reform itself into a pro-business party. Now, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front was the key element of that coalition, even though ethnic Tigrayans are about 10% of the Ethiopian population. That part of that political coalition, the Tigrayan element, was outsized, plays an outsized role in the victory over the Gerd regime in Ethiopia. And what's interesting about that is that it defected from this reform movement under President Abiy Ahmed Ali in 2019. Now, Ali wanted to reform the country to be pro-business and also to start to lay the groundwork for civic nationalism. Now, if you don't know what that means, the US is civic nationalism. It's not ethno-nationalist. China is ethno-nationalist, for example. India is civic nationalist. Okay, the more diverse a country, the more cohesive it is, the more civic nationalism it has. Now, his efforts at reform on the business side were succeeding very well, including in investment in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, that dam essentially siphons off water from the Blue Nile. The Nile obviously runs north, but it uses that to generate electricity. And once it's completed, it will be able to provide enough electricity for the entire country of Ethiopia. That also opens up all sorts of economic possibilities. Now, when CADILA came in the 2000s, it trained a local workforce. It did not import workers like China does. And it was actually a large contributor to Ethiopia's growth in the pharmaceutical industry and using Ethiopia as a beachhead essentially to export to the rest of Africa. Now, the reform efforts of Ali actually failed about a year ago. He actually, ironically, in 2019, won the Nobel Peace Prize. But once that coalition of parties that I mentioned started to fall apart about a year ago, you started to have ethnic clashes between the Tigrayans and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, that element of that coalition that defected onto its own and essentially declared independence from the rest of the country. That area is in yellow there on the map. And what that did was that sort of kickstarted a civil war. Now, in the process of it, what it did was it cut off Ethiopia from 2 out of the 3 main ports it uses for access to the outside world. It also started to spill over into other ethnic groups. So, for example, you have the Oromo in Ethiopia that are also now defecting away from the government, and the country is starting to slide back to ethnic violence and civil war. Now, while this is all happening, you started to have refugees going into neighboring Sudan. Now, for example, in November 2020, you had about 35,000 Ethiopian refugees in Sudan, near, believe it or not, where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is. That number doubled by March of this year. And you have a massive humanitarian crisis now in Sudan. And while this is happening, you have an increased dispute between Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia over the nature of this Renaissance Dam. So Egypt has about 103 million people, all of which are entirely reliant on water from the Nile. If that dam gets fully operational, that's going to potentially cause a massive water shortage upriver and potentially with catastrophic effect to Egypt. Now, Egypt and Sudan have become closer as a result of this. And thanks to Sudan's involvement, Sudan and Egypt are threatening to blow up the Grand Ethiopian Dam. Now, right now, Ethiopia is currently in a state of famine, and you're starting to see civil clashes, ethnic civil war, street by street in different parts of the country. Now, that has affected all manufacturing in the country. Most companies are still trying to ride this out. But as a result of this, additionally because of Eritrea's involvement, Ethiopia is essentially cut off from the outside world, especially if you're using it to access the rest of Africa, or if you're trying to export out of Ethiopia, because 2 out of the 3 ports are essentially cut off as a result of this conflict. Now, CADILA spent tons of money putting in greenfield investment into Ethiopia in order to access the African market and to serve as a beachhead for India's involvement in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, they did this because Ethiopia looked great on paper, but if they had done their due diligence research, the big question is, why didn't they go to Botswana? Now, I talk to companies all the time about prevention. Most companies do not like to invest in prevention, but a lot of dealing with political risk is actually prevention. Now, if you look at from the conflict side, Botswana has had virtually no conflicts other than one brief humanitarian intervention with a whole coalition of countries in the early 2000s, late 1990s. Ethiopia, on the other hand, is pretty war prone. It has very high corruption rankings compared to Botswana. It has very low levels of rule of law compared to Botswana. And in terms of business climate, it's actually a worse place to do business than Botswana. And if you're looking at the pharmaceutical industry in particular, which would relate to CADILA here, Botswana actually has no pharmaceutical industry in the country at all. It imports all of its drugs. Now, if they had gone to Botswana, CADILA would have been able to access the Ethiopian market still, and also access the South African market, but without any of the incumbent political risks. Now, this just kind of highlights the value of being able to do good political risk analysis before you decide to diversify your supply chain or just expand it into another region. Now, to kind of give you an idea of what political risk is, obviously war is one of them, but political risk can manifest itself in different ways. You can have government predation. Usually that takes place in the form of government seizures of property or excessive taxation that are targeted on specific industries or specific segments of the population. You can have regulatory capture, where you have an industry or a competitor that essentially owns the legislative process or the regulatory process, usually through some sort of political means. You can have outright corruption and bribery. You can have organized crime. You can have politicized competition. Maybe you're dealing with a state-owned enterprise. You can have hostile activism. So for example, if you're in the oil or gas industry, or even if you're not and you commute, being Southern California, your gas prices are going up as the result of environmental pressures, pressures from environmental activist groups to basically cut off the oil and gas industry. Now, even if you ideologically support that, that's coming out of your pocket, and it's going to drive up the cost of everything else for the foreseeable future until there's a viable alternative to oil and gas. And at this point, there is not. You can have weak state capacity. Maybe you're doing business where in some place like Ethiopia, where everything looks great on paper, but you're actually talking about a very weak state. You can have the threat of war. Talk about China a little bit later. You can have legislative risk. You can have terrorism. So for example, if you're talking about the high tech industry, there's some great places to invest in the Middle East, but you still have terrorism risks. You can have weak property rights. Even if things are relatively cheap and you invest there, doesn't mean you get to keep them. You can have demographic risks. Maybe you have an aging population in one country, such as Japan, and that creates its own risks, or you just have social fragmentation. There's not much social cohesion. We're seeing more and more of this in the US. You have poor infrastructure quality. You can have different union dynamics. If you're doing business in the US, union dynamics are very different than in Germany, for example. Germany, unions are very friendly to business because they actually work hand in glove with the executive board level. You don't really see that elsewhere. And you also have monetary risk. If you've been following the news lately, inflation is going up. That is not purely economics. That is the result of monetary policy that is ultimately political. You can have redenominational risk in the Eurozone. What if the currency that you're doing business in Greece, for example, suddenly switches from euros back to the drachma, and no one knows how much a drachma is worth? Well, that's a redenominational risk. We also have the risk of digital fiat currencies. There's a lot of talk about governments replicating elements of the cryptocurrency industry by essentially issuing digitized versions of their own currency. Well, that may sound great and efficient, but what happens when the issuer of that currency decides to cut you off or deny access to that currency? That allows for an entirely new type of political risk. Of course, you have trade wars and tariffs, and you can also have varying degrees of authoritarianism. And if you're looking around the world, including close to home, authoritarianism is actually on the increase. Now, that's just an example of what political risk is. Now, if you're talking about manufacturing, you can have a whole host of threats that are derived from these different types of environments that you do business in. And some of them are traditional, such as, tax risks, et cetera, a higher demand for supply chain transparency. If you're doing business in China, there's more and more interest about whether or not the industry in question is doing any business with slave labor in the form of concentration camps for the Uyghur population, right? You're talking about non-traditional threats, such as nationalization or partner reliability. Maybe it's a connected subcontractor that you're working with that has political connections. So the big question is, how do you deal with these risks? Now, before I get into that, I want to tell you where political risk comes from, because you may start to see it everywhere based on the examples that I've given you. Well, the world is not flat. It's taught in business school that it's all about profit and loss and efficiency, but that's not actually true. Where you do business matters quite a bit, even if on paper everything looks the same. At the very least, business is going to vary from culture to culture. I ask, for example, why do New Yorkers dress better than Californians? Well, does anybody have any ideas? Ultimately, it comes down to the culture and the economy in question, right? So because most people can't afford cars, right, in New York City because of the cost of having a car in New York City, they put their wealth into things like clothes as a signifier of status. In California, we put it into our cars. That is cultural and it's kind of domestic, but it gives you an example of this. Wherever you do business, the business environment is going to be shaped by institutions that are going to be shaped by the political dynamics and the culture of where you are doing business. And that is going to vary from place to place. And it's never going to be stagnant. It is going to be constantly changing over the course of time. So the world is not flat. Now, when I talk about this environment or your business doing, your supply chain being embedded in something called a political economy, that's not a grammatical error. What that is essentially the environment that you're doing business in is an intersection of the political and economic world, right? Because political dynamics are ultimately about power. Economic dynamics are ultimately about profit motive, right? Or market share. They are not necessarily always aligned. And where they do conflict and where they navigate around each other is where you're going to get different types of political risks. So for example, what is considered corruption in one part of the world, where it's fairly normal in India, for example, to bribe an administrator to get your kid into the best school. Here, that would be considered corruption, but over there, it's not. It's considered the normal part of doing business. Now, once upon a time, politics or political science and economics were actually the same field, and it was called political economy. It's only over the last few decades that they've been separate, and now they're starting to remerge again. But that kind of gives you an example. So the risks that you face are going to be of two main types when you're talking about supply chains. You're going to be talking about environmental risks that are going to be specific to a given country or state or even local government, local environment. And those are going to be things like regulatory institutions, specific types of political norms. And then you're going to have active threats, right? So maybe it's actor specific. So maybe it's state-owned competition, maybe it's key unions that are hostile to your industry, maybe it's a political party that wants to nationalize your industry or essentially put it out of business. Those are going to be more actor specific as opposed to environmental. Now, when you're expanding your supply chain, or even if you just have a nice supply chain you're very happy with, all of these things are going to be constantly fluctuating to varying degrees. And you need to be able to keep an eye on what these risks are, how they're emerging, and how they impact your supply chain. Now, these threats are in addition to the macroeconomic changes at the global level. So, for example, right now, there's a threat to the dollar. There's a very good chance that the dollar will not be the reserve currency in the next few years if the current levels of spending and inflation remain high. Now, if you're talking about supply chains, you have these varying spheres of threat awareness that you need to have, whether it's the global political economy. So, for example, what's going on in the EU or China? How does that affect you? What about the dollar, monetary risks, or even just where you're doing business specifically at the national level? So let's say you have a supply chain that's entirely in the US, or maybe you're a coffee shop and you import coffee from Ethiopia, ultimately sourced from there. How does that supply chain going to be affected by the key areas in which you operate? Then you're going to be looking at your competitors, right, in your industry. What risks are they facing? Are those related to what you are facing or not? How are they navigating them? And are your peers and competitors actually potential allies in mitigating these risks? Can you come together and lobby? Can you actually form a common front? Or maybe you can create some sort of new adaptation. Or actually, maybe if you want to sort of defect from the key industry, maybe you are willing to pay a little bit more and source in Latin America as opposed to China, knowing that when war, not if, but when war occurs with China and one of its neighbors, you will have an increased market share. Maybe you're willing to pay that cost up front now. And then ultimately, how these risks are impacting the dynamics within your own company. So going back to CADILA, for example, it trained its own local workforce. Well, that's great, but that local workforce is still going to be exposed in ways to the civil war taking place there, because you have workers of different ethnic backgrounds, and they are all going to be affected by the civil war in a way that imported workers from India, for example, would not be, right? So how are these risks manifesting themselves in your own company? Now, when I talk to a lot of potential clients, they kind of want to talk about their lawyers and their accountants. Well, that's great, but unfortunately, when you're talking about political risks, that's actually not enough. Your company really needs a political risk officer. Okay, and a political risk intelligence officer essentially examines your company's position in its industry, in the global economic and political context in which it operates, and should be doing that every year, at least an annual assessment. You should be looking at every country and locale in which you operate. Even if you have a small level supply chain, you're just doing business in one city, the city dynamics, believe it or not, will actually impact your business to a huge degree. So for example, if you're doing business in St. Louis right now, did you know that St. Louis actually has higher crime rates than Mexico City? That's part of the political risk, right? Even if you're just talking about local city politics, you're not immune to it no matter what size you are. So you should be doing some sort of annual assessment. Now, ideally, if you have a large enough company, you can train your own risk intelligence officer that can interact with the executive board level. Now, they can conduct annual assessments. They can look out for emerging crises that the executives might be worried about, like the risks emerging from a specific electoral outcome. What are the risks of civil war? What about a pandemic? I had companies asking me and individuals asking me in December 2019 about COVID-19. And I said, well, it ultimately comes down to whether or not China's telling the truth. Because this virus did not emerge in a shantytown in Central America or South Africa or a slum in Mumbai. It emerged someplace where it should have been able to have been contained, but it did not. So you're talking about either some sort of bioweapon, right, where it's malevolence, or at the very least incompetence. And either of those possibilities should raise some more red flags for you if you have supply chain exposure to China. for example. So if you're worried about a specific risk, the political risk intelligence officer at the executive level can keep an eye on these specific risks. They can look for cheaper supply chains or safer supply chain routes to help increase redundancy, to help avoid disruption. And I talk about China because a lot of companies asking, is China a risk? And I say yes, because if you look at all the macro indicators, China is going to be going to war with somebody, even if it's not the US, even if it goes to war with just Taiwan. India and Japan are going to get involved very, very quickly. And you're talking about a massive regional war. You're also talking about a war that could potentially spread across Asia, given that Pakistan is an ally of China's. And much of Pakistan's development is going through China. China is accessing the Indian Ocean through Pakistan. And of course, if you know the dynamics between India and Pakistan, they fought multiple wars in the past. So if you think that your little supply chain is going to survive that, and it's worth paying the long time, cheaper fees by having access to China as opposed to Latin America, just to say you've been warned. Because if you look at the macro indicators, war is going to happen with China and somebody, even if it's not the US. And your political risk officer should be doing due diligence assessments before any merger and acquisition that exposes you to a new locale. Because ultimately, when you're doing business in a new locale and you're expanding your supply chain, you are going to be not just doing business with that company and the way it looks on paper, you're going to be dealing with a company with its own biography, with its own corporate history and a set of relationships to the surrounding political and economic institutions in the political landscape in which it operates, right? And those things matter. It may be an intangible, but it's still something worth looking at because it can affect your balance sheet in a negative way. So risk intelligence is different than watching the news. Intelligence is different than information, and I use this term sparingly because when I use the term intelligence, people think, corporate espionage, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking a number of open sources, learning how to collate them, adding value to them in a way that makes sense, in a way that's digestible, and makes sense to the ultimately to a company's executive board, and provides a good assessment of what risks are involved, how intense these risks are, and then opens up potential pathways to mitigating these risks. Now, raw information can come from multiple sources. It can come from trade shows or regulatory updates, news articles, but you have to learn how to triangulate those news articles. And if you don't know how, please set up a consultation with me and I will teach you how. You can look at competitor advertising, ambient sources. You can look at social media, economic indicators, even something as seemingly far removed as a political speech by Xi Jinping. If he's giving a speech and you're concerned about your supply chain exposure to China, that can all be valid in terms of the information that it can give you in terms of a specific political risk that you're facing. Now, the way that you collate that into a comprehensive report is you have to know, A, the history of these regions and these countries that you're doing business in. You have to know the history behind these institutions, the dynamics, how prone they are to specific things. You may have to acquire raw data yourself, especially if you're concerned long-term. For example, if you're looking at Colombia, Colombia's had street clashes since April of last year over political issues. If you're looking at investing in Ethiopia, it might pay to actually do some on-the-ground research. And then you can look at different dynamics in the past. You can quantify some of these things, and you can start to get a good sense of whether or not the risk is going to explode or whether this is just something to keep your eye on. And ultimately, these estimates should include potential strategies for mitigation. And then you can gather more information as you need. But it's not watching the news. The news is actually a terrible way to try to mitigate risk. And if you don't believe me, the news called World War I to be the war to end all wars. Many people in the mid-2000s thought the US would never elect an African-American president. Trump was predicted to lose in 2016. The Cold War, a lot of people thought that would go on forever. Japan was viewed as an existential economic threat in the 1980s. You've had multiple predictions about environmental collapse. For example, in the 1980s, they thought that the subway in New York City would be underwater as a result of climatic environmental issues. Obviously, those things were all wrong. So if you think that watching the news is a good way to deal with political risk, it's not, to be quite honest. You have to know how to navigate that. Now, again, they are potentially, they can kill your business if you're talking about specific types of risks, but they are ultimately intangible, and your accountant is not going to be able to pick up on them. Your lawyer's not going to be able to pick up on them either, because just because a law may be on paper does not necessarily mean that law is going to be enforced the way that it says. That law may be selectively ignored depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. So even if you have a great contract with, a partner in China, does not mean that that contract is going to be honored. It does not mean that you're not going to face intellectual property theft. Even if you're talking about just the US, I can tell you that laws are increasingly being enforced based off of political dynamics rather than actually what is on paper. If you don't believe me, I can give you examples from the marijuana industry. You have contradictory laws there from one jurisdiction to another, including at the federal level. You see the same thing with guns. You see the same thing with immigration. You see the same thing with other things as well. And that is a dynamic that is unfortunately going to continue to evolve and unfold in the US. So just because something is on paper and your lawyer thinks it looks good, does not mean that that risk is not present. Now, right now, you have some larger sort of looming risks that are currently unfolding. You have politicized taxation initiatives, politicized enforcement of law. You have monetary risk. Obviously, if you've been following any of the news regarding inflation and the dollar, that's a very difficult genie to be put back in the bottle once it starts to get out of control. So, and if you look at the political dynamics currently, there's very little political will to sort of rein in that spending. So, okay, if you're thinking about risk, it's related to monetary exposure. How do you mitigate that? There are ways to do that. You have China, obviously a war risk with China. And then you also are looking at potential social and political breakdown in the US to varying degrees, depending on where you're at. So the news is not going to pick up on all of this. Now, to kind of give you an example of how you can survive this and how it is possible, that picture up in the upper right is not Wyoming or Montana. That's actually the Middle East. That's actually Turkey. That is the Uludağ mountain in northwest Turkey. Now, Uludağ water you can actually get on Amazon. It's essentially mineral water, but what's really interesting about it, you can get in all sorts of flavors now. You can get on Amazon Prime in the US to kind of give you an idea of how widespread the product is in terms of its market. But it was founded in 1912. Now, if you know anything about Turkish or Middle Eastern history, it survived the Ottoman coup against the current government there at the time. You had World War I, which Turkey was actually invaded, or the Ottoman Empire was invaded. You had years of foreign occupation in the area where Uludağ did business and manufactured water. You had Turkish War for Independence from 1919 to 1923. You had state-owned enterprises dominating most of the economic landscape from 1923 to 1938. You had a couple of decades of authoritarian rule from 1923 to 1950. You had multiple coups against the government over the course of the 20th century. You've had ongoing risks of terrorism. You've had massive inflationary risks from the 1970s up through 2002, an average of 34%. If you think 5% is bad with the dollar, trust me, it can get worse. You can deal with high levels of corruption and varying fluctuating degrees of authoritarianism. But regardless of all these risks that are all political, Uludağ managed to survive, and you can get it just about anywhere in the world. And this is just an example of a very simple product that has managed to sort of ride the storms, regardless of where its supply chain was located. Like I said, you can get it on Amazon, and it has survived all of these upheavals in its supply chain. So if Uludağ can do it, you can do it too. Now, with that, I'll sort of open it up to questions. If you want to contact me, then my contact information is there. And some of my services are also listed. But with that, I'll open it up for questions.
All right, so as anyone has questions, please put them in the chat box for the Q&A. So Ian, so maybe you could talk for a few minutes. It sounds like you are concerned about China, but maybe you could talk about some of the key places that we've traditionally used for the supply chain. So let's start with China. Like, what's your, current thoughts about that.
China is a perfect storm of political risk in more ways than one. So for example, at the monetary level, China has been trying to internationalize the renminbi, and with the dollar weakening, right, that provides opportunities for reshoring or nearshoring, or even if you're just purely manufacturing in the U.S., a weaker dollar makes your exports more viable. But China, one of the things that attracted investment into China and supply chain risk to China was its weak currency. Now, if companies and countries and central banks start looking for alternative ways to store their wealth other than the dollar, and they start going to the renminbi, which is China's currency, then that currency is going to become more expensive, which means that you're going to lose, even on paper, the very thing that attracted you to China in the first place. Number two with China is you're talking about state-owned enterprises, which means that they want you for your money. Ultimately, this is a political dynamic, not an economic one. This is not liberalization. This is not India that is liberalizing. This is not what people thought it was in the 1990s. Everyone operated under this mistaken idea that China is liberalizing its economy. It never did. It is still dominated by state-owned enterprises, and those are politically motivated, ultimately, not economically motivated. And if you look at China's economic orientation going all the way back to the 19th century, one of the things that it operates off of is, believe it or not, intellectual property theft. That's a long-time strategy that's not unique to China recently. So you have an ongoing political risk from that. You have other types of risks. China is perpetrating a genocide against the Uyghur population, even though it's not getting reported very well. It is occurring, and that is also a potential risk if it comes out that your company is sourcing from a key region of China that's connected to this. That could affect your business by people simply refusing to buy it, your products that are sourced there. And you also have the war risk. Even if the US does not get involved, you're looking at a potential series of events where you could have a cascade of conflict going from all the way from the Korean Peninsula all the way to Iran and potentially beyond, because if Pakistan and India get involved as the result of India and China going to war and then Pakistan siding with China, that's going to spill over into Iran. That could destabilize Iran and potentially the entire Middle East. So you're talking about a massive chaos belt, essentially, going from the Mediterranean all the way to the Korean Peninsula. Your supply chain is not going to survive that. And if you still are under doubts that you can manage that, most of these countries have nuclear weapons. I'll let that sink in again. Most of these countries have nuclear weapons. Japan could have nuclear capacity very quickly. People don't talk about that, but it could be a nuclear power if it wanted to. India and Pakistan have them. China has them. Iran is working on them, and Israel has them. So if you look on the map, right, and you go back to that, belt of chaos or whatever I was talking about, most of that map is covered by countries that either have nuclear weapons or are working on them. And just because the US and Russia did not use them does not mean that these countries will refrain from using them. And if that did happen and you had a catastrophic sort of series of events, the economy, you're talking about the entire collapse of one hemisphere economically. In which case you might regret not having relocated your supply chain to Latin America, because it'll be one of the only ones left standing. That's the worst case scenario, but it can't be ignored.
Wow. That's concerning.
It should be.
Very concerning, really. What about Vietnam? I know several clients had been moving. I know that it's obviously probably held up in that scenario you were just talking about, but
it is.
Tell us something about Vietnam and then the other place they're going to in that area, and then we'll go to other areas. But in that area is India, I would say. So if you could talk to Vietnam and India, not at the same time.
Sure. Vietnam is better in the sense that you're extricating yourself somewhat from some of the risks that China has, but you're still talking about an authoritarian regime that does not have a liberalized economy. They want your investment, but they won't necessarily respect your property rights. If you're looking for some place to invest in Asia overall in your terms of your supply chain, go to India. India actually is liberalizing. It has very warm ties with the US and they're getting warmer. You also have additional benefits to that in the form of there's a lot of Indian investment coming into the US now. You're talking about a fairly large expat community. It's kind of neat as a place to source from because it allows you to access other markets that you may not have thought about before. Because of its location, if you're trying to sell in Europe or you're trying to sell in the Middle East, or even if you're just trying to sell in East Asia, India is kind of centrally located for all of that.
Okay, that's good to
So,
know. So India is a is it goes China, then Vietnam, then India, as far as like preferences at the moment in a way.
I would go straight to India.
Okay, well, yes, I skip right over it is what you're saying. Got it.
Yeah. And if you're trying to resource back to the US or if you're looking at ultimately selling in the Western Hemisphere, I would say take it to Latin America,
Okay.
Eat some of the cost, but definitely look at Latin America.
So what, is there any particular places in Latin America that's better or worse? I mean, obviously there's Mexico.
Well, sure. It's going to vary. It depends on your industry.
Yeah.
And it depends on, what A, your industry, and B, if your kind of industry is more specifically prone to certain types of risks than others because they're not uniform. Some of them are environmental, but some of them may not be. So for example, if you're in one type of industry, you may have a higher density of organized crime and corruption in another country as it relates to that industry than with others. For example, you may have cartel risks that you have to deal with, not the drug sense, but in terms of, conglomerates working together that can sway the state. They don't like outsiders.
That's interesting. I wouldn't think it'd relate to an industry, but.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because especially in Latin America, where you have a lot of companies that are very state oriented, they have very close ties with the state. And if you come in as a competitor, then you're not talking about an even playing field, right? You're talking about politicized competition potentially, or things of that nature, or even just politicized partnership. Maybe you're doing an M&A. You're going to be doing business with very tight networks of companies that have a lot of political power, depending on the country you're talking about and the industry you're talking about. So you're still talking about a different type of risk, but it can vary from country to country.
But it sounds like, generally speaking, Latin America, I mean, assuming you sell on this side of the world, it sounds like that's like a better alternative than any of the ones we were talking about earlier.
It's a more stable one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And depending on your industry, there are some very neat opportunities, like in the Caribbean, for example. I talked to a software company not that long ago that wanted to nearshore to Latin America, and they just, knee-jerk reaction thought Mexico. And I said, well, it depends on, what you're trying to do. Does it have the right human capital that you need? Does it have the right tax incentives that you need? Because depending on what you're trying to do, the Caribbean can be really nice, but you still have to know where to look. So yeah, that's why you need an active sort of mechanism with your company in order to assess all of these dynamics ongoing, because it's too much for an executive to think about, and or even a regulatory officer or a legal counsel inside a company. These are things that are constantly changing. They are not necessarily on paper, and you have to know how to integrate information into a useful final product to make a decision.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I think the general thinking is, tell me if this is wrong, but that Mexico, generally speaking, is where more people think about going to. But it does sound like it depends on the industry as well, even for that, like Mexico versus, I don't know, Brazil or.
Sure. Like if you're talking about software, right, where you can literally do from anywhere, being closer, in Mexico is not necessarily gonna, get you special brownie points.
Yeah, no, that's
as opposed to going to Brazil.
More manufacturing. So like,
sure.
I don't know, what kind? Well, aerospace is like particularly problematic. So what would be like, I don't know, some kind of manufacturing that doesn't have like, too many rules, I suppose.
Doesn't have too many rules?
Well, like I'm thinking aerospace, you've got to like, there's a lot of regulations and those kinds of things you have to meet. So depends on what you're producing, I suppose.
Well, if you're talking about aerospace, and it depends on where you're trying to sell, who your customers are, but because you need you're talking about more sensitive technologies.
Right.
Those kinds of things can be determined by specific treaties that the U.S. has with different countries. So, for
Okay.
example, a lot of treaties have been being put into place since the early 2000s with India, believe it or not, to try to facilitate technological transfer to India. So a lot of those restrictions have been lifted for doing business in India with aerospace, for example,
Interesting.
as opposed to before. So yeah, so you'd have to look at those kinds of things in
I see.
treaties.
Well, that's I guess why you're saying you have to look at your the specific industry and what the situation is for that particular topic area.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, Latin America is definitely a better place to be, and it's certainly closer, generally speaking.
Yes, if you're talking about exporting, manufacturing, and exporting to the U.S., yes, it's closer and it's going to be cheaper as a result. And you're also talking about a region. Yeah, there are internal dynamics in Latin America, but you're not talking about the massive upheavals that you see in East Asia historically, or potentially upcoming in Europe historically, or even in the Middle East, or anything like that. The Americas are very calm, comparatively speaking, historically.
Yeah. Well, and somebody's asking a question. They were saying, it sounds like you're saying go to Latin America, which is what you're saying. And they're saying that labor rates have been going up in Mexico, which they've been going up around the world. But do you have anything since there are a lot of people in manufacturing and they're thinking about Mexico, what would you say the climate is in Mexico, not necessarily compared to other areas, but just like, are you expecting rates to continue to go up, or, I don't know.
I would say
anything in particular to be thinking about?
I would say right now, expect rates to go up for everything,
Okay.
everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
For the time being. But there are different ways to technologically upgrade. For example, if you do invest in Mexico, you can invest in new technologies that can lower your manufacturing costs without having to meet the same standards as you would in the US, for example, and other things like that that can help mitigate those costs.
Yeah, I see. Of course, then you do have transportation costs, which are also going up right now. Well, is there anything else? Like, how about the drug cartels in Mexico? Is this something that we should be worried more about right now? Same as it always has been? Worry less about it? What do we have to worry about in that case? More. Got to worry about everything more, it sounds like.
Well, you're talking, and I'm not trying to,
No, it's okay. It's reality.
I'm not trying to sell my products by saying it's a scary world, but right now we're talking about a very tenuous era. Yeah. That could get really bad really fast. That we're not living in a normal era right now. This is not the same world economically as it was in the mid 2000s. It just isn't. You're talking about, we're talking about the 1920s here, 1930s.
What about Europe? Is there any places that are better or worse than others in Europe?
Yeah, depending again on your industry. If you're talking about doing business in the Eurozone or the EU specifically, it is more expensive, but there are some gems nearby that are not as connected to the Eurozone or the EU, such as Albania, for example. That are very stable now that weren't in the past. And that gives you a lot of opportunities as well. So there are some, gems in the Balkans and things like that that will give you access to that European market, but without a lot of the regulatory risks and things like that that you see in the EU. And the EU is going to be facing the same sort of enforcement issues that the US does in terms of some countries. I see them opting out of just different dynamics coming out of the EU. The EU is probably not going to go away, but just because it's on paper doesn't mean it's going to be there in reality for specific issues.
Right. And what about the Brexit situation?
I don't think that was a huge crisis that a lot of people thought it was going to be. I never did, because the UK was never all the way in. Right. The UK has other risks incumbent with it, such as Scottish independence being one. If Scotland secedes from the UK, that creates a whole lot of risk that it's not just confined to the UK, but not only but also in Europe, because all of a sudden you're going to be looking at Catalan wanting to talk about splitting up. from Spain. You're going to be talking about northern Italy, potentially Greece falling out of the EU, or even places like Texas in the US saying maybe we should just go for it. Because if Scotland gets away with it, in a very developed, stable, country being the UK, if they break off from the UK and go their own way, that's going to open the door for a lot of other parts of the world. Taiwan, for example, I could see Taiwan saying we're going to go independent. And if you're talking about that, you're talking about a war with China.
Actually, that's a good point. So is there, what's your thing? So I guess that would be something to keep an eye on, right? The Taiwan situation, because it seems like
absolutely.
That's
the people I've talked to in Taiwan, every given day, they don't know if it's their last.
Wow. That's pretty bad.
That's how bad it is. And they go to war with that, they go to sleep with that existential threat in their heads every day.
Wow.
So yeah,
definitely concerning. How about the US? Like we were talking earlier, there's like certain places with more or less political risk in the US from a manufacturing supply chain standpoint. Do you have any comments about any of that?
Yeah, it's gonna get riskier. And a lot of that is going to depend between what happens now and in 2022. But right now we're talking about polarization levels politically in the US that we have not seen since the Civil War. And depending on how bad certain things get, states are going to be incentivized to go their own way and do things. They may not secede outright, even though Texas has talked about it. California talked about it in 2017 briefly. But yeah, you're going to be talking about other types of political risks that you didn't necessarily imagine before, or being as part of doing business in the US.
Wow, interesting.
What about Africa? Everyone's asking me about all these different places.
Yeah, what about Africa? Where a lot of resources available there. Why is that not utilized?
Well, it is being utilized. It is being utilized. You have a lot of investment coming in from India and from China, especially China. China's.
It's a future. Actually, the other people I've heard that come up. I don't know.
Yes, a lot of it's going to depend on how successful or not China is in its sort of neo-colonial projects that it's doing. China, what they're doing in Africa is very different than what the Europeans did. China is bringing in its own workers. It's putting in factories and then getting exclusive mineral rights and then bringing in Chinese workers that displace the locals. So that creates its own type of political risk if you're talking about investing in Africa, but that doesn't mean that won't make you more attractive if you're investing in Africa and you're coming from the US or elsewhere because you don't do things the same way. That's why a lot of African countries are looking at India as an alternative source of business partners, or the US. There's a lot of interesting things going on with the crypto industry in Africa right now, because cryptocurrencies allow investors in Africa a way to safely store wealth and smart contracts and keep track of legal agreements without having to worry about the corruption risks, thanks to blockchain technology. And if that gets widespread enough in Africa, you're going to have some stability emerging that you didn't have before, which will help mitigate future risks.
Interesting. Very good. Does anybody else have any other questions? I mean, this has been really very, very fascinating. It sounds like at a high level, there is more and more risk in the current state scenario, kind of across the world, but you certainly should be worried. And most of our well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of supply chains are in Asia and specifically in China. And so that's something to definitely worry about from our standpoint.
The quickest way that I can say this is, don't be under the false illusion that just because everything is economically connected, that conflict is not going to occur and spiral out of control. If you look at 1914, you can look at the European countries involved, and they were all economically integrated massively with each other, but that did not stop war from occurring at all. If anything, it just made it worse. It is a false sense of security that economic interdependence will actually help create peace. All it does is raise the stakes of war. It doesn't actually increase the likelihood of peace, because ultimately people want different things. Different countries have different interests, And even within countries, people have conflicting interests. It does not mean that, you know, your business contracts are going to be, oh, it's like, oh, let's stop the war because we have business contracts. It doesn't work that way in the real world. And history points that that's just not the case. So don't be under the illusion that interdependence economically is going to stop conflict from occurring, because it won't.
Well, in a way, I wish it did.
Oh, of course, of course. It's just, it's naive to think that, you know, oh, it won't happen. My supply chain will be fine. Probably not.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and I don't try to, I'm not trying to be a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist at all. I'm just a realist. And when my clients come to me, I don't tell them what they want to hear. You know, that's not what they pay me for.
Yep.
I tell them the risks that they're not aware of. So
Yeah,
if you,
well, that's what we asked you to do this webinar. So that's great. Well, so do you have any, is that summary thoughts, or do you have anything else you'd like to add? This has been really, really interesting and really fascinating. So.
Well, I hope it was helpful in sort of stimulating thought about different political risks that you're facing or that your members are facing.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. It's been really helpful because a lot of them have operations in Asia. They're looking at, well, in China, they're looking at Vietnam. They've been looking at India, looking at Mexico. So it's really, really all been very helpful. So thank you for doing that.
Yep.
We really appreciate that. And for the APEX Inland Empire and ASCM attendees here, we are going to continue next month in July with another webinar. We should be sending out that announcement shortly. And so look forward to that. It'll most likely be later in the month in July on a Friday. But we stay tuned for that announcement, and we will be archiving this recording on our Emerging Through Supply Chain Spring webinar series website. So stay tuned for that. And thank you again, Ian, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks
And
for having me.
hope you have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
All right. Thank you.